found in a 1903 German archive, the forbidden formula for permanent paint restoration, the ghost in the archive. The city of Nuremberg in the early winter of 1987 carried the particular silence of a place that had survived too much history. Snow had settled across its Gothic rooftops and cobbled streets overnight, muffling the sounds of the modern world beneath a layer of white stillness. Inside the Deutsches Historisches Archiv, that silence was even more complete. The archive occupied a narrow, four-story building wedged between a Lutheran church and a former government printing house on Bergstrasse. Its stone walls were thick enough to keep out both the cold and the noise of the city, and its interior smelled of what archivists poetically called the perfume of permanence, a compound of aged paper, iron gall ink, leather binding glue, and the faint chemical residue of decades-old photographic developer fluid. Wooden shelving units ran floor to ceiling in every room, each shelf packed with gray archival boxes, rolled technical drawings tied with cotton ribbon, and manila folders whose edges had turned amber with age. The overhead lighting was deliberately dim to protect the documents from ultraviolet degradation, which meant that researchers worked mostly by the light of individual brass desk lamps that cast warm, narrow pools of illumination across their tables. It was a place that seemed to exist slightly outside of time, where the present felt like an intrusion and the past felt immediate and close. Dr. Helena Wirth had been working in this archive for 11 days when she found the journal. She was a materials historian attached to the Technical University of Munich, assigned to compile a comprehensive record of industrial paint chemistry used in German railway engineering between 1880 and 1920. It was painstaking, unglamorous work, the kind that produced footnotes rather than headlines, and she had been moving methodically through box after box of administrative correspondence, procurement ledgers, and engineering inspection reports. Most of what she found confirmed what was already known. Then, on a Tuesday morning in the third week of November, she pulled a gray archival box from a shelf in the restricted sub-basement and found, tucked beneath a bundle of Prussian State Railroad maintenance circulars, a slim leather-bound journal. The cover was dark brown, cracked at the spine, and stamped in faded gold lettering with the initials FB and the year 1903. Inside the front cover, written in a precise, slanted hand, was the full name, Friedrich Balner, chemist, Royal Prussian Railway Engineering Division, Berlin Tempelhof Works. Friedrich Balner was not an entirely unknown figure in the narrow world of industrial chemistry history. His name appeared occasionally in footnotes, a minor citation here, a passing reference there, but he had never been the subject of serious scholarly attention. He had worked for the Prussian State Railroad during one of its most ambitious periods of expansion, when the network was pushing new lines into the Alpine foothills and extending service across terrain that exposed rolling stock to conditions far more extreme than the relatively temperate plains of central Prussia. It was precisely this expansion that had created the problem Balner spent the better part of 3 years trying to solve. The problem was the paint. Specifically, it was the paint on the Class P8 locomotives, the workhorse passenger engines that the Prussian State Railroad had begun deploying across its network in large numbers after 1902. These locomotives were painted in the deep, authoritative color known as Prussian red, a rich, slightly brownish crimson that had become the visual identity of the railway system and carried enormous institutional significance. It was the color of state power made visible, of German industrial pride rendered in iron and pigment. But the Alpine routes were destroying it. Within 2 or 3 seasons of regular service on mountain lines, the Prussian red was degrading in ways that the existing paint formulations had never been engineered to withstand. The combination of summer ultraviolet intensity at altitude, winter temperature drops that cracked paint films as the metal beneath contracted, the mechanical stress of ice forming in surface micropores, and the chemical aggression of the sulfurous coal smoke that engines produced at high load mountain grades, all of it conspired to strip the color from the locomotives with alarming speed. Engines that left the Berlin Tempelhof Works gleaming and correct arrived at Alpine depots after a few years of service looking bleached and chalky. The rich red faded to an embarrassing ochre orange that made them look neglected and shabby. For a railway system that took its public image seriously, this was not merely an aesthetic inconvenience. It was an institutional problem. Balner's journal opened in January of 1903, during what the meteorological records of that winter would later confirm as one of the coldest sustained cold spells Central Europe had experienced in 2 decades. His first entry described the temperature in his laboratory at the Berlin Tempelhof Works as barely 4 degrees above freezing, despite the coal stove burning continuously. His hands, he wrote, were too stiff in the mornings to handle fine measuring equipment until he had spent an hour flexing them near the heat. He was 31 years old, newly promoted and furious, not at the cold specifically, but at the problem that the cold was forcing him to confront with renewed urgency. Inside the journal, tucked carefully between pages 47 and 48, Helena found 3 photographs. They were glass plate contact prints, slightly faded but still clear. They showed the same locomotive, a Class P8, identifiable by its wheel arrangement and boiler profile, photographed apparently at 2 different points in time. In the first photograph, the engine's paintwork was visibly degraded, its surface uneven and pale, the color drained to that characteristic chalky orange that the maintenance reports described. In the second and third photographs, taken from slightly different angles, the same locomotive, or one indistinguishable from it, gleamed in a deep, saturated crimson. The Prussian red had come back. Whatever Balner had done in that freezing laboratory in the winter of 1903, it had apparently worked. The miracle in Stuttgart. The laboratory that Friedrich Balner had been assigned in the spring of 1903 was not in Berlin. Following a bureaucratic reorganization within the Royal Prussian Railway Engineering Division, his research unit had been relocated to a smaller facility on the outskirts of Stuttgart, housed in a converted textile storage building near the Neckar River. The building was functional rather than comfortable. Its high ceilings and wide floor plan had suited the storage of rolled fabric bolts, but they made it difficult to heat and nearly impossible to keep dust-free, which was a persistent frustration for precision chemical work. Balner had commandeered the warmest corner of the main floor for his workbench, surrounded himself with specimen panels cut from actual locomotive bodywork, and set about the problem with the methodical intensity that his journal entries revealed to be his defining professional characteristic. He was not, by temperament, a man who entertained dramatic expectations. His entries from this period are careful, procedural, and mostly dry, which makes what happened in early April of 1903 all the more striking in the record he left behind. The core of the problem, as Balner had come to understand it through the preceding months of analysis, was not the pigment itself. Prussian red as a colorant was chemically stable enough under normal conditions. The failure was happening in the paint film, the layered structure of primer, color coat, and protective varnish that formed the actual surface of the locomotive. When that film was subjected to the combined stresses of Alpine service, it did not simply fade uniformly, it fractured. Ultraviolet radiation from high-altitude sunlight attacked the molecular chains in the varnish layer, breaking the long polymer bonds that gave the clear coat its flexibility and cohesion. Thermal cycling, the repeated expansion and contraction of metal moving between cold nights and warm days, or between cold mountain air and the heat generated by the engine itself, widened those breaks further. What began as fractures invisible to the naked eye gradually opened into a network of microscopic channels running through the paint film. And through those channels, moisture and sulfurous combustion gases penetrated directly to the pigment layer beneath. The color was not being bleached from the outside. It was being chemically degraded from within through a structure that looked intact, but was, at the microscopic level, thoroughly compromised. This understanding was what made Balner's eventual approach so counterintuitive. Every conventional attempt to address paint degradation on railway equipment involved applying something to the surface. A fresh coat of varnish, a protective oil, a pigmented touch-up layer. The logic was straightforward. If the outside is damaged, repair the outside. But Balner had come to believe that this approach was addressing the symptom rather than the cause. The surface, in the worst affected locomotives, was not where the real damage resided. The damage was inside the film, in those microscopic fractures that no brush-applied surface coating could reach. What he needed was not a surface treatment. He needed something that could get inside. The breakthrough came from an unexpected direction. Balner had been experimenting with various dilutions of natural resin compounds, specifically a modified Dammer resin that had been used in earlier German railway varnish formulations, when he made an error that turned out to be the most productive mistake of his career. Attempting to prepare a test dilution, he accidentally added nearly 3 times the intended quantity of turpentine to a measured portion of resin solution, producing a liquid far thinner and more mobile than anything he had been working with. His instinct was to discard it. Instead, on an impulse, he never fully explained in his journal. He wrote only that the consistency reminded him of something, without specifying what. He applied it to a test panel that had been deliberately stress-fractured to simulate Alpine weathering damage. He applied it not with a brush, as was standard practice, but by laying cotton cloth soaked in the solution flat against the panel surface and pressing it with moderate hand pressure for several minutes. What he observed in the hours that followed changed the entire direction of his research. The solution did not sit on the surface of the panel. It disappeared into it. Where the fracture network was densest, the liquid was drawn inward most aggressively, pulled through the microscopic channels by the same capillary forces that draw water upward through a narrow glass tube or through the cellular structure of a plant stem. Capillary action, the tendency of liquids with sufficiently low surface tension to travel through fine channels against or regardless of gravity, was doing the work that no brush could do. The resin solution thinned to the precise consistency at which its surface tension fell below the threshold. The fracture channels required was infiltrating the damaged paint film from within. The science of what happened next operates at the molecular scale. Damer resin, in its natural state, consists of long, complex organic molecules, polyterpenes, and related compounds that, in solution, exist as individual chains moving freely through the liquid carrier. When the carrier, in this case the turpentine fraction, evaporated after the solution had been drawn into the fracture channels, those molecular chains were left behind in the confined space of the fractures themselves, at much higher concentration than they had existed in the original solution. Under these conditions, and particularly in the presence of trace oxygen that had penetrated the fracture network along with moisture, the resin molecules began a process of cross-linking, forming chemical bonds between adjacent molecular chains, building a three-dimensional network structure that was mechanically far stronger and more cohesive than the original unlinked molecules. The resin was not simply filling the fractures the way a liquid fills a container. It was chemically bonding to the existing paint chemistry around it and constructing a new structural matrix inside the damage. It was, in effect, rebuilding the molecular architecture of the paint film from the inside out. The practical consequences of this molecular bonding process were what made Balner's results so dramatic. A cross-linked resin network inside the fracture channels did several things simultaneously. It mechanically sealed the pathways through which moisture and sulfurous gases had been reaching the pigment layer, stopping the ongoing chemical degradation. It restored structural cohesion to the paint film, relinking the fractured sections into a unified layer capable again of flexing with thermal movement rather than cracking further. And critically for the visual result, it restored the optical properties of the varnish layer, the clarity and refractive quality that made the pigment beneath appear saturated and deep rather than flat and chalky. Weathered paint looks dull, partly because the fractured surface scatters light randomly. A healed surface, with its fractures filled and its structure consolidated, transmits and reflects light the way an intact film does, allowing the eye to perceive the full depth of the color beneath. Balner's first full-scale test on an actual Class P8 locomotive took place in late April of 1903 at a maintenance depot outside Stuttgart. He brought his diluted resin preparation in glass bottles packed in a wooden case, and he applied it at using cotton rags cut to a size he could press firmly against the engine's side panels with both hands. The application process was unglamorous. A man in a work coat pressing cloth against a locomotive for minutes at a time, moving methodically across each panel. The depot workers who observed the process were apparently skeptical. Balner's own journal entry for that day is notably brief, as though he was reluctant to record expectations that might not be met. He noted the temperature, the humidity, the lot number of his resin preparation, and the time of application. He did not describe what he saw. The journal entry 3 days later is considerably longer. The color, he wrote, had returned. Not approximately, not partially, returned. The treated panels showed a depth and saturation of Prussian red that he described as being indistinguishable from fresh factory paintwork. He went back to the depot twice more that week to examine the results in different light conditions, and each time the entry records the same observation. Whatever the molecular process had done inside that paint film, the visual result on the surface was unambiguous. The locomotive that had arrived at the depot looking faded and institutional now looked by any measure new, the Great Suppression. The decade that followed the First World War remade the economic geography of the industrialized world in ways that were not always visible at the time, but became structurally decisive in retrospect. Industries that had defined the 19th century found themselves navigating a transformed landscape in which the assumptions that had governed their operations for generations no longer applied. The great railway networks of Europe and North America, which had spent the previous 50 years expanding with the confidence of enterprises that believed their dominance was permanent, entered the 1920s in a condition of institutional retrenchment. The war had consumed capital, disrupted maintenance schedules, and accelerated the physical deterioration of rolling stock and infrastructure. The railways emerged from 1918 with aging equipment, reduced revenues, damaged track, and a pressing need to restore operational efficiency at the lowest possible cost. In this environment, a formula that could return a faded locomotive to factory standard appearance without the expense of full repainting was not a luxury or a curiosity. It was a practical economic tool, and the railway administrations that knew of Balner's work, primarily through the technical correspondence networks that connected German, Austrian, and Swiss railway engineering divisions, treated it accordingly. Restoration was not an aesthetic preference in this context. It was a budget decision. This institutional logic was coherent, consistent, and ultimately irrelevant to what was happening on the other side of the Atlantic. The United States, in the early 1920s, was experiencing the early stages of what would become the most consequential industrial transformation of the 20th century, the mass motorization of a continental society. Automobile production, which had been a relatively small-scale enterprise before the war, was scaling at a pace that had no historical precedent. Henry Ford's River Rouge complex, which reached full operation in 1927, represented an entirely new model of industrial organization. vertically integrated, immensely capital intensive, and oriented toward volume production at falling unit costs. General Motors, under Alfred Sloan's restructuring, was developing a different but equally significant model, one built on annual model changes, tiered brand positioning, and the deliberate cultivation of consumer desire for novelty rather than durability. These were not merely manufacturing enterprises. They were economic systems, and they required supporting ecosystems to function, networks of suppliers, dealers, service providers, and, critically, a paint and bodywork repair industry capable of handling the inevitable damage that mass vehicle ownership would produce. The economic structure of the automobile repair industry that formed in American cities during the 1920s was shaped by a fundamental tension that its participants were largely aware of, but rarely discussed in direct terms. On one side of this tension was the consumer interest in vehicle durability, in paint finishes that resisted weathering, maintained their appearance over time, and reduced the frequency and cost of professional repairs. On the other side was the revenue interest of the industries that serviced damaged and deteriorated vehicles, the body shops, the paint suppliers, the equipment manufacturers, and, at one remove, the automobile manufacturers themselves, for whom a culture of replacement rather than restoration was commercially more productive than one of longevity. A car owner whose paint finish lasted 15 years without significant deterioration was a poor customer for the repair economy. A car owner whose finish began visibly fading or oxidizing within 3 to 5 years was an excellent one. This tension produced what can only be described, with the clarity of hindsight, as a structural incentive against durability, not a conspiracy in the dramatic sense of secret meetings and explicit agreements, though such meetings certainly took place in the boardrooms and trade association gatherings of the period, but a systemic alignment of commercial interests that produced the same outcome that a conspiracy would have produced. The paint manufacturers who supplied both the automobile factories and the aftermarket repair industry had the clearest view of this alignment. They understood that a product which genuinely and permanently restored oxidized paint surfaces, which reestablished the molecular integrity of degraded paint films and extended their functional life by years or decades, would, if widely adopted, reduce the frequency of full respray jobs, and thereby contract the aftermarket paint market that generated a substantial portion of their revenue. The incentive to develop such a product was therefore structurally weak, and the incentive to ensure that existing products with this capability did not achieve wide distribution was, from a purely commercial standpoint, structurally strong. Balner's capillary resin infiltration process entered this environment through the mechanism of technical publication. German railway engineering had a tradition of sharing technical innovations through industry journals and through the formal correspondence networks of railway engineering associations. Balner's work had been documented in at least 2 technical publications in the years following his 1903 experiments. The journal entries that Helena Wirth found in Nuremberg referenced correspondence with colleagues in Vienna and Zurich, and cited 2 articles that Balner had apparently submitted to German-language engineering periodicals. These publications would have been accessible to technically literate readers across the industrialized world, including the American chemical engineers who were building the paint technology infrastructure of the new automobile industry. What happened to that knowledge in the American context is traceable not through what was published, but through what was not. The technical literature on automotive paint chemistry that was produced by American manufacturers and trade associations during the 1920s is extensive, detailed, and, on the specific question of penetrating resin treatments for oxidized paint surfaces, essentially silent. This silence is not explicable by ignorance. The cross-linking chemistry that underlies Balner's process was well understood in theoretical terms by American industrial chemists of the period. It was being applied in other industrial contexts, including in the emerging synthetic resin industry that was producing new lacquers and varnishes for automotive use. The absence of this chemistry from automotive restoration literature was not a gap in knowledge. It was a gap in publication, which is a different thing entirely. The boardrooms in which these decisions were made were not populated by cartoonish villains. They were occupied by rational economic actors, men who had built substantial enterprises and who understood with complete clarity that the long-term health of their businesses depended on the continued existence of conditions that made their services necessary. The body shop owners, who met through regional trade associations in Chicago, Detroit, and New York during the mid-1920s, were not unusual in their commercial thinking. They were doing what industries do, organizing to protect their market position and to resist developments that threatened it. The paint manufacturers who attended the same trade events and supplied those body shops understood the alignment of interests perfectly well. Technical knowledge that undermined the economic rationale of the respray industry was knowledge that the industry had powerful incentives to ensure remained obscure. The mechanism of suppression did not require active destruction of documents or dramatic acts of censorship. It required only that certain technical approaches not be promoted, not be included in trade training curricula, not be featured in the industry publications that shape the professional knowledge base of working paint technicians and body shop operators. Knowledge that is not taught to the next generation of practitioners is knowledge that effectively disappears, not because it has been destroyed, but because the human networks through which practical knowledge travels have been redirected. By the mid-1930s, the capillary infiltration approach to paint restoration had ceased to appear in the technical literature that was shaping the American automotive refinishing industry. It existed in European railway engineering archives, in German language publications that were not being translated or circulated in American trade contexts, and in the practice of a diminishing number of European railway maintenance operations that had inherited the technique through direct institutional memory. The industry that filled the space that Balner's process might have occupied grew, over the following decades, into one of the most economically significant sectors of the global automotive services economy. By the early 21st century, the automotive body repair and refinishing industry was generating revenues estimated at $48.6 billion annually in the United States alone, a figure that reflected, in its entirety, the commercial logic that had quietly ensured, a century earlier, that durable alternatives to the respray economy did not find their way into mainstream practice. The ghost of Friedrich Balner's 1903 laboratory work haunted those numbers in a way that no balance sheet would ever record.